If you're going to eat beef, it should be grass-fed, right? After all, that is the best beef out there. Well, today on the Harvest Your Health podcast, we're going to be talking about this grass-fed term, and I'm going to give you 4 reasons why the grass-fed label really doesn't mean anything at this point. So let's jump into this, guys. And this whole conversation that I've come to with you today has been a part of a bigger conversation that I've been having in the background with other professionals, with individuals in the lay public, and trying to help them understand what grass-fed means and how that term is being used. And I wanted to bring this conversation to you as well because I have a feeling that maybe what some of you are interpreting as grass-fed and what you think you're getting a lot of times, those two don't exactly match up. And we're going to talk about why that is. And also I'm going to give you some understanding of ways that you can be able to make better choices and actually get quality grass-fed, like grass-fed of the level that you think that it should be and actually is what you're getting. So let's jump into this. I'll tell you sort of as a backdrop here, this conversation really evolved out of the supplement industry for me and talking to other professionals, healthcare professionals that were using products that had a grass-fed label on it, or as I'll share with you in an example, they were using a product that didn't have a grass-fed label and all of a sudden it had a grass-fed pasture-raised label on it, but nothing about the product changed. That's a big red flag. So we need to have some type of understanding of what the grass-fed definition is. And I want to give you this from what it is supposed to be, and then we're going to talk about the reality of what it is on different levels. All right, so what the definition of grass-fed is supposed to be is that the animal for the entirety of its life, and in this case we're talking about cattle, but you could extend this to all ruminant animals, so whether that's buffalo or goats or sheep, this conversation would still apply there. But grass-fed is supposed to be that animal for the entirety of its life has consumed nothing but grass and forage, and the only exception to that being during the early months of its life where it is still nursing from the mother, where it is drinking milk. So the milk ingestion phase being the exception to that, and that is up until the point of weaning. But from when that animal is weaned from its mother, from there on, it should be consuming grass and forage. So those are going to be herbaceous plants. After all, we're talking about herbivores here. These are herbaceous plants. These are not going to be plants these are going to be non-grain plants, would just be simply another way of saying that. And then you get into things like forbs, you hear that sometimes, but that's going to be like your legumes or your brassicas. Some ranchers will plant brassicas in the cooler months since that's when those plants grow, like kale, for an example, or radishes. Or not radish. Radish is not a brassica, but rutabagas. That's what I was thinking. Rutabagas or turnips. Turnips being more common here. They'll plant those, and when those leafy tops come off of those plants, the cattle will graze those in the cooler months when they don't have the naturally growing grasses in the environment. So those are all acceptable, right? But the big thing here is that we're trying to avoid more of what we would see falling into a grain category. So we don't want to see any type of corn, soy. We don't want to see say for example, peas get harvested or some other type of bean or legume. You don't want those being fed to the animal. We're trying to ultimately reduce these grains. And you even have to bring into this conversation things like distiller grains, because sometimes those are used, obviously grains are used for alcohol production. And sometimes those grains get fed back to the animals. All of those things would not be considered acceptable in a grass-fed model. All right, so that's what we're trying to stay away from. But here's really the crux of the conversation today, and this is where I want to take us, is I want to give you the reasons why this grass-fed label just doesn't mean a whole lot anymore. And one of the reasons is many of you sitting in the United States are looking at this label and you're thinking, I'm seeing a grass-fed label, and that means that animal came from a farm or a ranch in the United States. It's a domestic product, and it was harvested in the United States and processed in the United States until it ended up on the shelf that I purchased it from. Well, here's what I'm going to tell you on this, guys, is that most of the products, most of the grass-fed beef products that are on the shelves in the United States actually come from outside of the country. They're not products, they're not domestic products. They're coming in and they're getting labeled product of the US, but these animals are actually being raised outside of the country. And many of these imports will come from South America, countries down in South America like Uruguay. You'll see a lot of these come from Australia and New Zealand. And I'm going to come back and talk about that in a minute, because I feel like that is becoming the elephant in the room that everybody wants to tiptoe and dance around. And we're leaving this conversation off of the plate, so to say, when we really should be addressing this one head on. So I'm going to come back and talk about that, because I feel like that's a big thing we need to address here. But when you're buying, say like you go to Walmart or you go to Target or wherever you go, your local grocery store, and you into these big chain stores, and you're looking at a grass-fed product, chances are the majority of these are coming from outside of the country, from those other regions that I made recognition of. Now, here's the problem with this, is that maybe these products are grass-fed to the level that we think they are, whatever that actually means, right? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Maybe they're not. You don't know. There's no chain of transparency, and there's no way for you to trace that chain of transparency back to know that the grass-fed product that you're getting is actually meeting the criteria that you have in mind for what a grass-fed product should be. There's no way for you to trace that down. There's no way for you to go back and ask these companies questions, the supplier questions, certainly not the farmer or the producer, the one that raised these animals. You can't ask them questions. And then even when you're outside of the country, do they have the same grass-fed standards that you're looking for? Maybe not. The other thing that can be a problem in this part of the conversation is that there's an opportunity for a lot of unscrupulous acts to take place here, simply because the demand for grass-fed is significantly on the rise. In fact, over the next 10 years, grass-fed beef production is expected to increase. The market is expected to increase by $10 billion. $10 billion. So there's a huge amount of market share there that is being fought for. And many know that if they can use this grass-fed term and use it in a way where it's allowed to be used by definition, and not the definition I started us out with, but what's considered an acceptable definition, where they're bending the rules of what actually grass-fed should be, then they're going to put a grass-fed label on that, and the average consumer is not going to know any different, and they're going to pay the premium on that grass-fed product, when in reality, it's probably not any different than the commodity product, right? So that's a big problem, but that's just part of what happens out there in the market, but you as the consumer can work around that if you know that this is taking place. Now, this increase that we're seeing in this expected growth, it's expected growth in the U.S., it's expected growth globally, not just isolated to the U.S., but what we see is that there's a shift from the conventional commodity product beef to more individuals being interested in grass-fed beef. And if companies and the agribusiness community knows that that demand is there, they're going to work every way they can to try to put a grass-fed label on as much as they can, because they know that that product is likely to get picked up ahead of the commodity product. Now, this is interesting because a lot of times when you look at the rising popularity of some of the other sources of protein out there, sometimes we'll hear about your beef is not as popular of a protein source as it once was, that other protein sources are more common or more popular now. Plant-based proteins are coming really heavily into the marketplace. But it's interesting, if you go over and look at the beef consumption over the last couple of decades, if you start all the way back in from 1960, and I'm going to use information coming from the National Chicken Council here, and this is looking at the per capita consumption of beef And I'm also going to bring chicken into this conversation because that's the most popular, probably the other most popular meat out there. If you look back, let's start in 1960. This was when this was initially recorded. In 1960, it was 63.3 pounds is what the average person consumed of beef. If you go all the way up to 2023, it's 58.1. So we see a 5 pound, over the course of a year, 5 pound drop in how much someone is consuming beef. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at chicken went from 23.6 pounds for the average person back in 1960 over to 99.5 pounds for the average person. And that's looking at broilers. So that's looking at what you might consider a pastured meat chicken. That's what we call a broiler, right? And so you see a significant increase in broiler meat consumption. And the interesting aspect of this is that this clearly illustrates that there is still a demand for protein out there, and that what I took away from this is that if the chicken market, if the chicken industry can change the way that it's bringing chicken to the market, not saying I agree with that, but if they can change the way that they do that, then the beef industry can make a change in the way that it does that as well. So you're finding that with this whole conversation around most grass-fed sources are coming from outside the country. This is where you get the big meat packers that are coming into the conversation. There's only 4 big meat packers in the United States right now, so that in and of itself is a problem. And that goes back to this whole conversation that if you've listened to any of these podcasts that I've done, you've heard me talk about centralization of the food supply. These big packers are centralizing the food supply, and that means that they're controlling more of it. And the more that these larger entities control that, then the less likelihood that you know what you're actually getting and what the true supply chain is for the food that you're consuming. So let me go back to the elephant in the room, as I alluded to early on. And this is looking at this, what's become a very popular conversation now about Australia and New Zealand, and we should be sourcing grass-fed from those countries and doing that at the extent of not purchasing from within the United States, not using grass-fed suppliers within the United States. And keep in mind, guys, grass-fed suppliers within the United States, it's about 4%. So about 4% of ranches and farms that raise cattle are doing this in a grass-fed model to the degree that you as the grass-fed consumer would want it done, okay? Now, as I say that, that is a very small percentage, right? Most of these are not. Most farms out there are not grass-fed. They're conventional. And that is the norm in the United States for the conventional model. If you look in these other countries like Australia and New Zealand, these guys do a phenomenal job. They have a great environment over there. But the narrative that's out there is that this can't be done in the United States. And that's a falsehood. That is absolutely not true. There's producers like myself, the producers that I interact with, that I have relationships and friendships with. There's others out there that I see the work that they're doing that are running grass-fed only operations that are doing an absolutely phenomenal job. And what nobody inherently wants to talk about on this is if the animal is so much better from the other country, then let's do a nutritional analysis between an Australian or New Zealand cut of meat and an American cut of meat. And I would venture to say that you're not going to see much of a difference in the nutritional quality between those two meats. The other thing that I'll bring into this conversation later is that there's also, I've come to learn this inherent assumption that if the animal is raised grass-fed, that also means that they don't get vaccinations, are not exposed to antibiotics or any other type of chemical. And that's not the case either. These are two different conversations. So again, it goes back to you're sourcing something from outside of the country and you don't have any chain of transparency. Not that the ranches in these other countries are doing anything wrong. In fact, there's a lot that we've been able to learn here in the United States from the work that they've done over there. My point here is that if we don't support the market and the ranchers and farmers in the United States that are making the effort to run grass-fed only based systems and to actually avoid the toxic inputs into these animals and the land that they're raised on, then there's no reason for that market to grow, and you shouldn't expect that market to grow as the consumer, which means that ultimately finding these products is going to become more and more difficult for you. And it also means that these larger packers are going to be able to use these terms against you in a manipulative, deceptive way, which I'm going to show you exactly what that means here momentarily. But if we have to get behind the local market. So this notion that we've got to go outside of the country to get quality grass-fed beef, that's a falsehood, and we need to get away from that ideology, and we need to, the individuals that are out there espousing this narrative need to be put in their place on this conversation, because all you're doing is hurting the domestic market the more you continue to spout that off. Okay, so enough on that. You guys can clearly see where I stand on that point. Now, here's point number 2, right? I've got 4 reasons why this grass-fed term doesn't mean what we think it means anymore. So here's the next one, and this is the USDA. God love them, right? They have their good and their bad, and this is not one of their brighter moments here. But they have the current terminology around grass-fed is based on a percentage. So you may see sometimes in the store 100% grass-fed, 90% grass-fed, 50% grass-fed. 50% is the lowest, that is the minimum that can go on this. But the point is that what most people are cluing into, we're so hyper fixated on the grass-fed part of that label that we tend to overlook the percentage part of that. You can't do that, all right? If you want to trust in what you're getting, you have to pay attention to this percentage when it's used. So you'll see things like 90%, 75%, and those are misuses of the definition of the grass-fed. Remember, grass-fed should be that animal is from the time, even before it's weaned, because cattle are going to be grazing on grass within a day or two of being born. We see them do it all the time every year, right? And so in those first few months, in the first 4, probably 3 to 6 months, depending on when they're weaned, they're eating grass and consuming milk. But then after that 6 months, they're moving on to grass consumption, and then depending on how they're finished, whatever they're getting finished on. But the point is on this is that the USDA, and this is why I made the comment earlier, the USDA allows products to be labeled as 50% grass-fed, which is a problem, right? So it's either grass-fed or it's not. We're not 50%, we're not 75%, we're not even 90%. Either you are or you're not. It's kind of like being pregnant. Either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. So we have to get away from this notion that using a percentage is an acceptable model for labeling grass-fed. It's not. And when you look at, let me give you some background here so you can understand these differences in this grass-fed, where I want to take you on the next part of this. There's 3 stages that most ranchers, farmers, producers, however you prefer to say that, fall into, and they can be a combination here. So within the cattle business, you have what's called cow-calf operations. So that's when you have mama cows and you're raising the mama cows and the calves. And then the second stage is going to be called backgrounding. This is when the most weight is being added to the animal. So this is what we would consider maybe their adolescence, for lack of better terminology here. But it's the point at which the animal is really going through its maximum growth phase. And then the third phase is going to be finishing. Okay, so you've got those 3 areas. So I gave you that because as I tell you different ways that this grass-fed term can be used, I'm going to show you how each of those phases can get manipulated. Not so much the cow-calf, the early first phase, but more so the second and the third phase. So here's how, when you look at, if you wonder how does that percentage come into play, like what actually derives that percentage? Well, there's a couple of ways that percentage can be derived. So let me give you 3 examples of this. So the first one is you can feed or background the animal on grass and then finish them on grain. Okay, so if you finish them on grain, then they were still fed grass through that middle or backgrounding stage, but you finished them on grain. Well, technically that, by this USDA definition, can still be labeled as grass-fed. okay? But it has to have a percentage associated with it, but you're still seeing it as grass-fed. The next option that you can have is that you can background the animal. Remember, this is when they're putting on the most weight, their most weight gain. You can background that animal on something like silage or grain rations. So not solely on grass or the forbs that we were talking about earlier, legumes. You can have a grain in the mix in that backgrounding phase, but then finish them on grass. So in that middle phase of life, they were given grains. They were not 100% grass-fed. So now you can still, because you finished them on grass, you can still say there's a certain percentage there that's grass-fed. And then the last option that you can have on this is that you can finish in a grass-based feedlot. So this would be someone who would say, I have a grass-fed animal, but they're not pasture finished. Maybe they're pasture raised, but they're not pasture finished. And so all of these are manipulative ways, not that necessarily any of these are intentionally manipulated. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. That's not for me to make a judgment about. But the point is that these realities of what these percentages of these grass-fed labels mean don't translate to what you think you're buying in the store or wherever you're purchasing grass-fed from, okay? Now, in reality, and let me show you a graph to help illustrate this, just so you can have a picture of how these can be differentiated here. There's 4 categories of finishing an animal. And I've got this report here that came out in 2017. It has a beautiful illustration of what we're talking about as far as finishing methods and production methods. But when you look at the 4 categories of finishing, you can have conventional finishing. So that animal is confined and grain finished. That's one. The second is that you can have a pasture-raised animal. So note this now, this is where some terminology gets messed up too, and where most people don't really think about the terminology. Pasture-raised means that that animal can be consuming grains. It doesn't mean that that animal is only consuming grass. So many people look too deeply into the terminology of pasture raised and think that it means more than what it actually does. Don't be led astray on that. The third option that you have is that you can have a grass feedlot. So you can have a feedlot scenario, and lifestyle is going to be a part of this conversation too. You can have a feedlot scenario but be fed grass products in that feedlot, right? So that's part of it. And then the fourth option, as far as a category of finishing, is that you can have pure grass-fed. And this is what most people think of when they think about, when they see this terminology, they think the animal is being grass-finished, they're out on pasture, and all they're consuming is grass. And that is what most of us are looking for. That is what our acceptable definition behind grass-fed is. But these other ones, these other 3 finishing categories that I've given you are also the reality. And many times pasture raised and grass-fed lot options are what are also getting a grass-fed label put on that product. So are you getting what you think you're getting? Probably not. Now, the third reason that this grass-fed terminology doesn't mean anything is that we constantly mix up the terminology. The terminology is mixed up in the commercial space. The terminology is mixed up in the professional and academic spaces. It's mixed up in the lay public. So what the heck are we actually asking for when we ask for grass-fed? There's much confusion around that. I recently read a publication that is a really good publication on the nutritional values in grass finished versus pen finished animals. And even in this publication, there was some mixing of the terminology there. Grass fed implies grass finished, but it doesn't say grass finished. We have to say grass finished to actually know we're getting the product that we're looking for. On our range van, on our delivery van, one of the things that Leah and I were very emphatic about when we were putting what we did and what we offered on the van is we didn't want to just say grass fed. We made sure that van also said grass finished because we wanted that point of differentiation, and we wanted our customers to know that what we were doing was different, and there was only grass products being fed to these animals, only their natural forage being fed to these animals for the entirety of their life. And I always go back to, if you're doing something right, you want to shout it from the rooftops, you're proud of it, you want people to know. But if you're not doing it, then you're okay hiding behind other terms. And that's exactly what the majority of the industry is doing with this. So when we say pen finished, or feedlot finished, or grain finished, right? So when we're talking about the conventional model, we use the term finishing. It's the last phase of how the animal is raised, right? Of what environment they're in. Well, why don't we also say grass finishing? It's such an easy terminology to adapt and use, but nobody wants to be accepting of that terminology and begin to implement it in. And in reality, it should be a wide-scale terminology. But we know, and it's very easy to see now, the further we make discussion about this, that if that were the case, there would be a lot of dollars lost because individuals wouldn't be buying grass-fed products anymore. They would be seeking out grass-finished products, is ultimately what we should be looking for anyway. Now, here's the fourth reason that grass-fed really doesn't mean anything. Many people conflate grass-fed to mean organic. Those two don't have any relationship to each other, guys. They're not the same thing, okay? So you can't overlap these two terms and expect that what you're getting in a grass-fed package also meets the criteria for organic. And the grass-fed terminology does not reflect the lifestyle of the animal or the environment. It only, to some degree, it reflects the environment, but I'll speak more on why there's not totally reflective of the environment here in a second. But it's not just the diet, okay? There's more to these animals and more to the environment. So, for example, here at Harvest Hills Ranch, we're rotationally grazing. These animals get moved every single day. They're moving to a new paddock. They're eating fresh grass every day. And we're making sure that the moves that we're making are putting enough pressure on the pasture to allow them to get the nutrition that they need, but get them off of it so the pasture can rebound. So we want enough pressure put on the pasture and on the grasses to get them to, in turn, once the cattle move away from them, to rebound and continue their growth and continue to regenerate and feed the soil. Another avenue we could discuss more. But here's the thing, is that when you don't give perspective to the lifestyle, and again, this terminology doesn't do that, then you have no consideration were vaccines used in these animals, were pesticides and herbicides used on the ground that these animals are grazing over. You don't know that. Are there GMOs? How many of you want to eat GMOs? Many of you are trying to avoid GMOs, but just the grass-fed terminology does not speak to whether or not GMOs are being utilized in synthetic fertilizers. What's in those synthetic fertilizers? We don't know a lot of times, right? Some of these could be petroleum-based. There could be many things that are in here that you, as the average consumer, that are going out of your way to make healthier choices, probably don't want in there. So the point on this, guys, is that grass-fed gives you no insight about any of those aspects of things that you're probably already attempting to avoid through other food choices that you're making, but have equally detrimental effects on your health, okay? Now, I want to speak, I'm really, up to this point, I'm talking about food, and most, when we think about grass-fed, you're thinking about beef a lot of times, and you're thinking about maybe grass-fed ground meat or a steak or some other cut. But I want to speak about supplements for a moment because, and I want to be specific on the supplements that I'm talking about and associate this with collagen. Collagen is a hot product right now. It's very popular out there in the marketplace. And I'm noting that some of the suppliers out there are starting to put grass-fed on their collagen products. But it's interesting, and I can think of one really popular, maybe even the most popular supplier of collagen out there with the pretty blue label that puts grass-fed on their labels, but then when you go to their website, gives you absolutely no transparency about anything grass-fed about that product. I also mentioned that another product in both the commercial space and in the professional nutrition space, that these products have recently started using the terminology of grass-fed and pasture-raised. And when I initially saw this, I've been familiar with this product for some time. When I initially saw this, it made me think, well, maybe they changed the formulation. I go back, I look at the formulation, nothing's changed on this product. It's the exact same 3 trade ingredients. It's coming from the exact same supplier. You go to the supplier's website and you look more at what their supply chain is and where they're getting their animals from, and they say nothing about the animals being grass-fed or pasture-raised. But here's the thing about that. As I've shared with you, all these cattle are all grass-fed. They're all spending time on pasture. So it's the finishing phase that we're seeing nothing about. So when you see these grass-fed labels, these pasture-raised labels on these supplemental products, don't get all woohoo about that and think that you've just gotten the golden ticket or the premier product in the marketplace. Guys, you're buying into a label, and that's just the truth of it. These products are no different many times than the ones that don't have the label on there. So let me share with you, now that I've presented all this, let me share with you a couple of organizations out there that provide a grass-fed certification. And there's 5 of these out there. And they're not equally all the same, and I'm not going to give these to you in any particular order in terms of better or worse. But you have the USDA. The USDA has a grass-fed certification, but again, we talked about the percentage aspect of that. There's also the American Grass-Fed Association. They're one of the more well-known associations out there. There's the Greener World. They are more of an animal welfare organization, but they also have a grass-fed certification, and I'm going to a point with this on each one of these. And then there's the Food Alliance, and then there's the PCO certified grass-fed. So there's 5 different options I've given you. And the question you would ask many times on these, especially like on these supplemental products, who's the certifying agency for your grass-fed? Or are you just saying that? Do you actually have a certification standing behind you? Or if you don't have a certification, and I'll tell you why there's a place for that momentarily, if you don't have a certification for that, tell me about the transparency chain, the transparency for your supply chain, how that animal is handled from start to finish, from birth to harvest. Tell me about that. If you can tell me about that and you can give me specifics, then we can look past the certifications. But if you can't, it's a red flag. I mean, it just is. It's a red flag, right? So what are the solutions that are out there that we can actually lean on? Well, here's a couple of solutions that I think we have to think about here. One is that we have to recognize that if we're depending on labels, we're already behind when it comes to understanding where our food's coming from. You cannot depend on labels. We have to get away from this ideology that a label tells us everything we need to know about the food. It doesn't. There's loopholes. There's ways around these labels. There's ways around getting these terms on a label. And you better believe that these companies out there that are producing and marketing these products, they're doing that. They're using every loophole and turn that they can. The next solution that we have to come up with is these certifications that I've shared with you are not realistic certifications for the average farm out there. In fact, if you go to, and I've done this for myself, because I am considering some of these certifications for Harvest Hills Ranch, but I'm going to tell you why these really probably at the end of the day don't matter, okay? So if you look at these certifications, they're expensive. They're not like a little expensive, they're very expensive. So when you start processing and getting charged per head of animal that you process, or when you have to have a $165 an hour review and there's no definitive term about how long a review is going to be or how extensive a review is going to be, in an agriculture space where you don't have huge profit margins, you can't gamble like that. You just don't have the capacity to be able to do that. So we have to come up with realistic ways for producers to make these certifications, if we're going to depend on them, more obtainable. But here's where I stand on this. I don't think that producers need to get all bought into these labels. At the end of the day, guys, they're labels. We've seen over the years the dilution of organic, how the USDA has had to go back in and revamp the organic standards because they did become so diluted, and that other organizations are actually doing the work for the USDA on the organic certification, and they have their own faults and problems with them. So there really is no no long-term stability and truth in these labels and all these terms that we get so wrapped up in. We've got to stop doing this. At the end of the day, what matters, and this is where I speak to you as the consumer in the choices that you can make, but also equally to you as the producer of where your head should be on this, is that you've got to stop depending on these labels. You've got to go out and illustrate to the public what your product is, how your product is different. If you're raising it and doing it right, don't stand in a corner and expect people to come to you and not go out and share the value and the difference in your product. Be proud of your product and put it out there so that other people can benefit from the knowledge, but also the value, the nutritional value of the product that you bring in, and they want to develop a relationship with you because of how passionate and how involved in your product you are, right? That's what we as producers should do. So forget these expensive certifications and don't become so dependent on those on the producer or as you, the consumer, either. There's also, when you look at a lot of the wording in these certifications, what it takes to actually get these certifications, they give specifics to the processing facilities. Processing facilities are their own independent businesses. We only use at Harvest Hills Ranch small family processing facilities, so we can control everything, but that's not the case in every corner of the United States. So you don't always have control over another business or whether or not that business has the desire to go out and get a certification. Frankly, the processors that I use, I trust them. I know what they do. I step into their facilities. I'm in their facilities every time we process. But they don't have the desire to go out and get these same grass-fed certifications. So therefore, me getting a certification of a grass-fed nature becomes a hurdle because of using that processing facility. And for those of you that think, well, oh, just go down the road to the next guy, there's not a processing facility on every corner, guys. I live in Texas, the biggest cattle production state in the United States, and anywhere you go from me, it is at a minimum of 2.5 hours. And there's only one that's 2.5 hours. Most of them are over 3 hours to get to the next processor. So it's not as easy as just picking another one. You have to develop relationships with these processors. One, it's more important for me to make sure that that meat is being handled and cut in a way that is acceptable to me and that honors the life of that animal and doesn't waste that animal in any way. That's more important to me than a grass-fed certification for that processing facility that really at the end of the day has nothing to do with how that animal was raised or finished. So take that for what it's worth. And then we need to, as a community, producer, consumer, across the board, we need to be more adamant about using or recognizing the idea of the finishing phase. Are we getting grass finished products? Let's quit hanging our hats on this grass fed term and let's start talking about grass finishing. That's what's important between the two phases. It's the last 3 months of life when the fatty acid profile of the animal is going to have or is going to be mostly impacted. That's also when we see an accumulation of what are known as some of the secondary metabolites that are going to be found in the meats. So those get heavily influenced in those last 3 months. And then the last point I'll make on this, and the one that could resolve all of the things that I have brought up in this podcast, is that we need to create transparency between the producer and the consumer needs to know the source of your local grass-fed beef. And we need to support the local markets. Right now, as a whole, we're not supporting local markets when it comes to grass-fed. We're supporting international markets. And that is not, I would be willing to bet that if I asked the majority of individuals out there, would you rather support the international cattle industry or would you rather support the cattle industry that should be putting beef on your table in your backyard or in the farms that are local to you? Which of those two would you rather support? most people are going to support their local food producer, their local rancher and farmer. They're not going to support the international industry. What's happening outside of this country shouldn't matter when it comes to beef production. What's important is, what's the farm down the road doing? Whose hand can I go down there and shake? Whose hand or whose eyes can I look into to know that when they tell me and when they show me the things that they're doing on their farm and ranch, that I can actually trust and you know when you're being lied to. When someone won't make eye contact with you, when they don't give you a firm handshake, you just get, that's the scumbag feel right away. You know when you're being lied to, when you're being cheated. And so you want to be able to vet that out for yourself. And guys, listen, if that means that it takes a little more effort than going down to the grocery store, you know what? Make a little more effort. Your health and your life and the livelihood and the longevity of the food supply that you have access to is worth it. At least I think it is. So, support local. That's the most important part of what I'll leave you with on this. And take this term grass-fed. Think about the things that I've said today. Think about the things that I've shared with you today. And ask yourself, when you go and you look at that term grass-fed, ask yourself, am I really getting what I think I'm getting? Or can I go and can I develop a relationship with someone local to me and actually get truly grass-fed and finished meat? And that way, I'll be able to go out and harvest my own health. I'll be able to take control of my health into my own hands. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. Take the opportunity to harvest your health. You'll find that the benefits are worth it. Until next time, we'll see you soon.